Welcome to Vale la Pena. In English, that's worth your while. I'm your host, Cynthia Ribas. This is a show where we get to do some grassroots philanthropy together. In all episodes, we'll feature nonprofit organizations engaged in inspiring projects for people, animals, and the environment. Some guests will be representatives of those organizations, and they'll share with us more about initiatives they're working on and ways we can participate. Check the show notes for opportunities to impact these humanitarian causes together. You can find this show through my website at www.rebuslegal.com and on YouTube, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Now, please join me for Vale la Pena. Welcome to Vale la Pena. I'm Cynthia Ribas. I'm your host. And our show, for any of you who's new here, is about grassroots philanthropy. And the way we do that is we talk with guests who are up to all kinds of interesting things. And we talk about things that are worth our while, like the show title in Spanish. Vale la Pena means worth your while in English. And one of these days we'll be syndicated the world over and we'll be doing this in Spanish. But today it's in English. And our topic today is modern slavery or human trafficking. And we have a very special guest tuning in from London. She is Natasha Draycott. She is a barrister, one of the most sought after and well-regarded juniors in the UK bar. She's with 5 St. Andrews Hill Chambers. And let's bring her on so we can get this going. Hello, Natasha.
Hi, Cynthia. How are you?
So great to have you here with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, these topics are big, and it's really fantastic to get an international perspective on the show here. So you were perfect to do that for us. Now, let's start at the beginning. You're a barrister. We don't use that language here in the US. Please tell us, what does that mean?
Sure. So I think barristers are involved predominantly in courtroom advocacy and litigation. I think they're similar to what you call trial lawyers or litigators in the US. Although I think maybe trial litigators and trial lawyers in the US maybe perform other tasks behind advocacy courtroom, if I'm right. Whereas in the UK we have barristers and solicitors tend to do more of the work which is not so courtroom based.
That's right. And we do have, I'm an example where I do corporate work. I'm outside general counsel to small to medium companies. A lot of that is transactional work. And then I'm also a trial attorney. I started off as a trial attorney, and then I evolved into doing transactional. And then you have trial attorneys here who, they interface with the client, and they are also doing other things in addition to arguing before the court. And I understand that barristers pretty much are exclusively permitted to argue before your courts. Is that right?
Yeah, what you do sounds super impressive because it sounds like you do all of it, which whereas barristers tend to, apart from the advisory work I do, a lot of it, and most days I tend to be in court. I used to do criminal trials, which was quite exciting, doing the jury advocacy, which is a great kind of training ground and stuff. But now I do extradition, human rights law, public law, and that's not jury based. That tends to be in front of judges, high court judges or district judges. But predominantly in court most days.
So you're in the robe and you're in the peruke, the wig, everything, right?
Exactly. You've got the magistrates court in England. So I'm really in 2 courts. I'm in the magistrates court with extradition, and that one is a bit more relaxed. So no robes or gowns in that one, just smart attire or whatever. And then we've got the high court or the crown court here. So the high court I go to if you're appealing like an extradition case. And then you wear these collars, white collars, wig, which is made of horsehair, and then this long gown. and you're meant to have the wig for your entire career. I think my father, my grandfather, they both did law as well, and I think there's this myth about it holding brain power, so you're going to just keep it for the whole time, which is good because it's quite expensive actually. So I haven't lost mine yet. Yeah.
Family, like you actually wear the one your grandfather wore?
So I don't wear that one. My sister, a lot of my family barristers. One of my sister is my younger sister, so she's got that one. So I think she wears that one. Yeah, so there's a whole sort of attire that you put on when you go to court, which is particularly good when you're quite junior, actually, especially if you're quite nervous, because I think the idea is that whatever race you are or age or that everyone's kind of equal, as it were, in the eyes of the law, and it's a good it's quite a good mask as well to put on. So you go in and perform, as it were, and then you come out, take it off, and go back to normal. So it's an odd thing. I know they don't have that in the US. I don't think anything like that. Do you have any props at all, or?
Well, there is definitely, like, people who watch media sometimes think lawyers wear all these super flashy clothes. And even when I watch good legal shows, which of course I love, I'm always amazed at how they dress the women lawyers, because in real life, it's just not how it goes. For the most part, any really serious case, we still keep it to black, gray, or navy. You tend to shy away from anything overly flashy. Now, my sisters out there are going to say that's not true, and we need to break out of that mold. And yeah, I certainly, in certain court appearances, I see some color, but it's not uncommon. I mean, still, there are more men than women who are actually in most any courtroom that you go to here in the US. So mostly all the men, of course, are just in suits, and they really do keep it to black and gray.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, you'll see a little bit of color, but the idea is to keep the topics are important. So we want to keep the focus on what it is that we're trying to do. We're serving people, and we need that judge to understand us, and we don't want our dress to distract from anything, right?
Exactly. And also, if you're in a rush and you're getting ready in the morning, it's quite good just to have a bit of a uniform, really. Like going to school, I quite like just having black, grey. It's all quite plain. So yeah, we don't have much colour here either. And I think it's also quite useful for the judges actually having their robes and their wig, because I always think sometimes after they leave court, they've got to go and get on the tube or the train like the rest of us. So probably helps if they don't like bump into the defendant when they're at the tube station. So it's probably quite helpful for them to have a bit of a disguise as well, I would have thought.
Sure. Yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk a little bit about extradition. That's what you were saying is your specialty. And explain to us, what does that mean?
So extradition is the process whereby one country is surrendering an individual to another country, either for prosecution or to serve a sentence for crimes committed in the requesting country's jurisdiction. So, for example, if I'd committed a crime in the US, murdered someone, committed a fraud, and then I'd fled and come to the UK as a safe haven, as it were, then my job would be, if you're arrested here, to raise various arguments, predominantly human rights arguments on your behalf, to stop you going back to the US. And the funny thing is, actually, if you win the case, then it's not that you're then punished in this country, you're just free, and that's the end of it. So, for example, with some clients, if they're sought by, I've got a client at the moment sought by Brazil. One of the arguments you'd raise in that case, he is gay, and the prison conditions in Brazil are horrendous. So you would raise human rights arguments to do with prison conditions, and you'd get experts in court. And sometimes you'd have countries like Brazil issue what you call a prison assurance, saying, if he goes back, we'll look after him and he'll go to this specific prison. But you often find that those assurances are not particularly reliable. So you can raise arguments about that as well. So yeah, I predominantly defend raising those kind of arguments. Also mental health issues, whether people are sought for political reasons, which happens with a lot of countries, particularly with Russia before. I mean, there aren't really any Russian extradition requests now for obvious reasons, but that was always, they always used to issue a lot of requests for it would be cloaked as them wanting someone back for a crime they've committed, but quite often Putin would want someone back for political reason. So you tend to win. You used to tend to win those cases if you're representing someone sought by Russia. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what it is.
Then it's all a function of treaty, right? In between the two countries.
Yeah, that's right. So there's the US-UK treaty, which I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think it was signed in 2003. And in this country, there's been a bit of controversy about that treaty. It's known as being quite a lopsided treaty, weighted in favor of the US, because there's a requirement for the UK to show an evidential case, whereas there isn't the requirement the other way around. And I have a lot of US cases in particular. They're probably the most, yeah, I think out of all my cases, I've got 6 or 7 of those at the moment. And they have the power, the US, which is quite unusual, to be able to reach out around the world and try and get people back to the US, even when there's a very, very tenuous connection with the US. So, for example, a lot of my clients have never actually set foot in the States. The crimes that they're said to have committed are ones that they've committed on, online frauds or, because there's a connection to the US, they can issue a extradition request to return them. One quite famous example of that is a guy called Gary McKinnon, who was autistic. He suffered from Asperger's, and he's fought extradition to the US for over a decade. And in the end, the Home Secretary here decided not to send him back. But he had hacked into computer systems at the Pentagon looking for evidence of UFOs. He'd never been to America. And eventually, this country decided not to send him back. And following that case, there is something called the Forum Bar now, where you can be tried here for crimes, like that. But generally, in my experience, if the US want you back for something like that, even if you've never been there, it is super hard to fight extradition because of the nature of the political relationship between UK and the US.
Is that the best reason we have for why it's so lopsided? Why you think it's lopsided?
It's difficult to say why the history of why that happened or why we signed it. I don't know in practice how much difference it makes, but I know that the US have far more far-reaching powers than we do tend to get people back. I'd have to look at the statistics, but I think that we definitely we send more people back there than or I'm trying to think which way around. But yeah, it's definitely lopsided, I think, in terms of statistics. I'm not quite sure why it's like that. It's been the source of a lot of controversy here, and it often comes up in Parliament as something that should be corrected. Simply because you have I think there was the NatWest 3 here. There's a lot of quite well-known cases where people say, well, why can't they just be tried here? Because there's a connection. The offences were committed on US soil, so we should try them before a British jury or an English jury. But because there's some sort of connection to the US, they tend to issue these warrants. So they're quite interesting cases, those ones, and I've got a few of them at the moment.
And then you were mentioning, I do know that it's a function of treaty, but I understood there are certainly some treaties where even if, for example, the requested person will not be returned to the US, they will have to face prosecution in their home country.
So generally with extradition, so for example, if I'm a Brazilian guy I'm representing at the moment who sought for murder in Brazil, if we are successful with that case and the prison conditions argument is successful, he won't be punished here. He will just walk free. So the only time it happens very, very rarely, but if there's a crime for which someone is sought by the US and there's a connection between the US and the UK, and we can show that there's enough evidence here to try him here, Very rarely they will be tried here. But quite often with extradition, if you win, the person just walks free, and that's the end of it. So, I mean, one country, if you are going to commit some horrible crime, to go to as a safe haven is somewhere like Yemen, for example, a country where they really don't have extradition treaties with anyone. And there's a horrible case actually that's been in the press recently in the UK. Very, very wealthy guy in Yemen who murdered I think she might have been Swedish girl after they'd been at a nightclub quite a few years ago now, and he went back to Yemen and he hasn't come back here, and awful for her family because he just can't be reached. So yeah.
And just to spell some of it out for listeners a little bit, as I understand it, some of the reason why lawyers like yourself fight so hard to keep people from being tried in the U.S. is our death penalty, right? Well, but a lot of countries don't have that. So just the idea of that even being a possibility is perceived as a human rights concern.
Yeah.
Or
so you
require the jurisdiction to actually say, the prosecution to say they will not seek the death penalty in a particular case.
That's exactly right. So it's a given with extradition that we just wouldn't send anyone back to any country that has the death penalty, including the US, and the US are well aware of that. So it goes without saying that would never be a possible sentence that you'd see in a request. With US cases, one of the other real issues is the supermax prisons as well, and some of the prison conditions. Particularly supermax prisons are a real breach of people's human rights for obvious reasons. I had a client recently where we were quite successful because he was going back to DC jail, which I think received a lot of press in the States because of the Capitol Hill rioters. Some of them were sent there, and that's an absolutely horrendous prison. Drugs, corruption, awful violence. And we had an expert in that case, and we were able to show how bad the conditions were. And in the end, there was a sort of concession. Well, not a concession in an obvious way, but the prison was changed. And so the person I'm representing won't be going back there anymore. But I was surprised at how bad some of the prison conditions were. And I think they're terrible in this country too. So it's certainly not just the US.
Yes, we have tremendous issues in terms of our prison conditions, and that supermax, of course, is intended to be maximally punitive. And it's always so interesting to talk with people around the world because, figuring out fair punishment, figuring out justice, figuring out what to do after it's been determined that a crime has been committed, those aren't easy issues. And we don't all necessarily think the same around the world. So like you take the famous case of, say, Roman Polanski, right? Rape, he was 43, she was 13. It was, he did serve apparently about 42 days, which is a lot. In a lot of rape cases, you can't even get that much here in the US for lots of reasons. But then, of course, he loses. He goes to Switzerland and he loses. And then more recently, he comes up in Poland, right? Because he's got citizenship in Poland as well. And the high court there, as I understand it, reversed again the appeal to try to get him to the US. He's in his 80s now. I don't think he's ever going to get back to the US for that trial, but it's that kind of thing we're talking about.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I think that's really accurate. I think he served something like 2 days in prison. Then he fled before the sentencing hearing. And the US had been trying to get him back for a long time now. And I think it hit the press certainly. I think in 2003 he won. He was nominated for an Oscar for The Pianist. I remember he certainly wasn't able to go back to the Academy Awards for that. And then because I think he has dual Polish and French citizenship, and I think France historically don't like extraditing their own citizens. And so, yeah, I think in 2016 or fairly recently, Polish Supreme Court decided they just weren't going to send him back. But I mean, with his career, I mean, he's slightly problematic given that he makes movies and he can't go to the US. But as you said, he's in his 80s now, and I don't think he'll ever go back. No. But that's a famous case like that. Yeah, for sure. Um, the Prince Andrew one was another one recently where there was a lot of talk in the UK about whether he would be extradited, but that was a civil case for which he was sought, and you can only be extradited for criminal proceedings. So he wouldn't have gone back either. But there was, there was a lot of interest around that.
Right. He was sued. It's woman is the case is in New York, and it's civil, so no right of extradition.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's right. So he would never have gone back. And then there's the issue maybe of possible immunity as well, which would have been an additional thing, which might have protected him. But no, you can only be extradited for criminal proceedings, not civil proceedings. So he would have been okay.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's get to this other topic of the day: modern slavery or human trafficking. Talk to us a little bit about what that means. A lot of times people think, oh, slavery happened a long time ago. No. What's happening now?
Yeah, so modern slavery and human trafficking is something I come across quite a lot, particularly recently in my extradition cases. And I think human trafficking and modern slavery is really an umbrella term for forced labor or sex trafficking. And it doesn't require movement, so it's not like people smuggling. You can be exploited or trafficked or subject to modern slavery in the town that you were born in. It centers really around the traffickers and their aim to exploit you and to use, enslave you, manipulative practices and deceptive measures to keep you, under their coercive control. So it's different to people smuggling. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions about it is that it happens in sort of poorer countries around the world, where actually it happens very much in the UK, in the US, in very wealthy countries in particular, because of supply chains, and because I think rich countries have the demand and the resources to precipitate it. One example being just domestic workers. So yeah, I come across it quite a bit in extradition cases. I have a client at the moment. I won't go into the details of it, but she was in a southern state. That she was born into. She was trafficked around the US by a white supremacist gang, forced to work as a prostitute. There's evidence we have about judges in this state and police officers being involved as well. Horrible, but very, very difficult to prove, and very, very difficult to stop her going back, because obviously the US have their own conventions in place, and they will say in response to my arguments, well, if you send her back, we'll look after her. But naturally, she's terrified of going back there because of what might happen to her if she's released from prison. She probably won't serve a very long sentence. She's only sought for minor fraud offences, but it's what will happen to her when she's released from prison, which is why she wants to stay in this country. So the point being that it's everywhere. It's hidden in plain sight.
Right. And in just my prep for this interview, I was looking at some statistics, and there isn't a one type of victim, that it actually affects men, women, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds. I mean, definitely, if we just were to pull out the sex trafficking component, something like some crazy high 91% or so affects women and children. But if we include all of forced labor, that's a big part of what's involved here. It is definitely happening in the US. In fact, California, I was reading, has the highest number of incidents. The US Department of Homeland Security has something called the Blue Campaign that's really all about everything, for just helping people learn about it and be able to identify when it's happening so you can report it. Tell us a little bit about what to look for. How do we even know that something may be going on here that's illegal?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think one of the best ways to try and do something about this is, first of all, to realize it could be happening next door to you, and that is really something that's hidden in plain sight. So being familiar with spotting the signs, which I've been able to do with victims in the cases I have, is really useful. I mean, there's really obvious sort of signs, like someone, signs of injury or abuse. Quite often, a lot of victims frequently don't seek help because of language barriers, fear of law enforcement, fear of their traffickers. I mean, often victims lack personal identification documents. One of the first things the traffickers do is take away all of their documents. They lack personal possessions. They tend to avoid eye contact, law enforcement, any sort of social interaction, often responding in manners which we seem sort of rehearsed or scripted, often appearing perhaps, as you said, abused or malnourished. But it's also being aware. A lot of victims tend to be in certain forms of employment. So in this country and probably in the US, in agriculture, fruit picking, obviously in the sex industry, just doing aware on a very simple level of where we're buying our clothes, where we're buying our fruit and vegetables from, familiarizing yourself with supply chains is one thing you can do, certainly. Just becoming more aware of it, I think.
Right. And even in California here, I know they recently passed a law. It's all aimed at trying to get people to not, particularly like people in hotels and motels, to not turn a blind eye to what they actually see, because that's all part of even what we're doing here. We all need to be talking about these issues, raising awareness about these issues, being vigilant about what we can all do to help each other. There is a hotline in the show notes. We're going to be sure to put, if you need help, there's actually a human trafficking hotline number you can call. It's manned 24/7 and over 200 languages. So don't let that be a barrier. There's also a text number that we'll give you. You can text, and there's also a website we'll give you if you're looking for support. And then there's another number to call if you suspect human trafficking and you want to bring in the federal, local law enforcement. So we're going to provide those resources in the show notes. Talk to us a little bit about the kinds of industries where maybe it's more, kind of the hot spots.
So I think, well, certainly with Los Angeles, I think the reason that there's so many victims in Los Angeles, because it's a top point of entry into the country for victims of slavery and trafficking. I think it's kind of the perfect melting pot. Diverse communities, a sprawling city where it's easier to hide and move victims from place to place. So it makes it much more difficult for law enforcement to spot, potential survivors. And the difficult thing also, if you're a victim of trafficking and you manage to escape, you're vulnerable to it again, because then you're out again, your personal possessions have been taken, you don't have any money. So it's a horrible sort of vicious circle. The kind of industries, I think, are, well, as you said, people can become enslaved from making our clothes, from serving our food, from picking crops, working in factories, working in houses as cooks, cleaners, and domestic servants, even nannies. So they're the more sort of obvious jobs, and obviously, as we spoke about, particularly in Los Angeles, there's a lot of sex trafficking as well. And I think all of this got exacerbated by the pandemic, because quite often victims are in debt in some way to their employer or in their trafficker. And I think one of the first things that happens when there's a crisis or a pandemic is that those in vulnerable parts of the world tend to suffer the most, because there's the least visibility. So, for example, with COVID, there was a need for lots of equipment, so coercive labor practices were accelerated, so people could provide, various things that were sought by wealthy countries. And I think we've got to be careful with social media as well. I mean, social media, I think, particularly post-pandemic, because it led the pandemic, obviously, to an increase in social media and online technology. And I think that's social media particularly is used as a tool to entrap people all over the world, particularly children, teenagers. But also, I mean, your social media profile can give away a lot about you. So if a trafficker does their research, they can tell if you've got an issue with drugs or with debt, mental health issues with your family, and they can, use that very slowly to groom you. And then they can also operate with greater stealth with the internet as well, because as you mentioned, hotels earlier, a lot of this stuff, I think, particularly in Los Angeles, takes place in hotels. And then they can use technology to market and transfer sexual abuse material to buyers. But I think, as you said, that bill is being passed where hotels are now, I think, more liable in Los Angeles if they know that trafficking is taking place in their hotels or motels. They are under a duty, I think, to report it. I don't know if that's gone through yet, but it's certainly a good idea.
Yeah, and I was looking in the US, like in addition to California, like some of the other states where there are lots of these incidents, it has to do with, in part, one, all the international influx, right? All the airports, also the borders. So Texas also has a lot of incidents, Florida and New York. And again, it has to do with just the volumes of people coming in,
Yeah, exactly.
More so, more so than, say, some of the interior states. But you have to be looking at it really everywhere. And definitely the main point is what you said earlier, that we need definitely here in the US to be present to the fact that it is a real problem here in the US. It's not just something happening in other countries. And there are other resources that we want to make sure people are aware of. There are lots of different other organizations, but a couple I just want to mention are, there's one called the Deliver Fund, and we're going to, in the show notes, link up how you can participate with them. But they actually provide a lot of training for local law enforcement. I myself was looking at how I might be able to participate in getting some of the training, because even training doctors, training just people to know what to look for is really important. And then another one is Safe Horizon. And that one also, provides all kinds of interim facilities to support, really help people get back up on their feet. And, as you mentioned, the age group, a lot of these people are children, and it is particularly devastating because the consequences are for life in many cases. And Safe Horizon is another organization that is available to people that are looking to try to put their life together and get away from whoever the handlers are, or whatever the circumstances are that have them caught up in one of these improper labor mills or any of the worlds of sex trafficking. And of course, all the online crimes, that's become just a huge area where even all of, I know our penal codes are always trying to just catch up to the kinds of crimes that people are engaged in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even you just doing this podcast is just hugely important, because if you're doing this, or if you're a journalist, podcasts, media, it plays a huge part in guiding conversation about trafficking. That's how people find out about it. So, and I think the same if you're a lawyer, if you're able to do some attorney, some pro bono work, and you come across trafficking victims, providing any legal support you can is also super helpful, and something that I try and do where I can. But really spreading information, I think, in your local community. And as you said, if you think someone's a victim of trafficking, calling the National Trafficking Hotline, or obviously you can make a donation to lots of the brilliant organizations that you just mentioned as well. But it's difficult because it is invisible. So the most important thing is to try and help to provide some visibility where we can, and to shine a light on those really dark corners where no one can see, because especially with children, if you're not registered in school, you've got no documents, it's very difficult to try and track down. And these traffickers are incredibly using incredibly clever and manipulative methods. I mean, one thing that's quite interesting, I think there's some apps which I read about. I think they might be, I don't know if they're international or in the US, but one of them is called Traffic Cam, which is quite interesting, because a lot of the sex trafficking takes place in hotel rooms or motel rooms, as we were saying, particularly in California. And I understand that that's now where you can take a photo of your hotel room that you stay in, and you can submit it to a database, so that when the law enforcement are looking at videos or pictures of sexual abuse, it helps them to identify the locations or the photos of where the trafficking victims are. Like we were saying earlier, that there's now onus on the hotel or motel to report, something if they think that something is happening on their premises. But equally, if you're staying in a hotel, you can take a picture and upload it, and it will actually make a difference. Something as simple as that. And I think that's called Traffic Cam. That app. And there's other ones. I think there's Stop app, which is an app. I think it's one of the first global apps available, and it's in lots of different languages to help report any suspicion that you might have about human trafficking or modern slavery. And I think there's Truckers Against Trafficking is another one I read about, which is a mobile network of transportation professionals, which assist law enforcement in recognizing and reporting traffickers as well. So there's lots of things that can be done, but really raising awareness. So you doing this podcast is fantastic.
Well, in the world of grassroots philanthropy, it all just starts with, we got to start talking about the issues so that we all have a sense of what the problem is, so we can start getting into the solutions. And the solutions are definitely varied and many. And the invitation is, of course, the classic donation to some of these fantastic organizations, but also volunteer opportunities. And like another one is Amnesty International. They do such great work around the world. They have a fantastic article. I was looking in there. They are always updating the initiative. So I invite people to check their website, and that will also be included in the show notes. But they have a particularly compelling article on slavery in the US, and some of these, in particular with regard to labor. They were able to have some busts of some of these labor rings. It's all just so very tragic. But we need to, be aware of it and be vigilant, and do what we can, do what we can. That's the main thing. And we're all busy. I know for me, this podcast is just such a fulfillment of a dream to be able to, obviously my law practice is an expression of service. It's all about service, and that's where the fulfillment comes. The podcast is just an extension of that. We kind of get out from doing the more classic legal matters and talking with just real people about real issues and what we can really do. You shared about volunteering time. I, a few years back, volunteered time on the border. I went to the border of Texas, where there was just this influx of all these people that are literally walking up from Honduras or wherever with their little child in their arm. They're escaping all kinds of gang violence and other horrors. It's just completely shocking. And they need legal talent. So for all of the lawyers listening, do what you can to volunteer time. There's such a need for pro bono work in so many areas of practice.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you were saying as well, I think people recognizing the distinction which is happening more and more, as opposed to seeing them, these victims as criminals, because obviously they will through no fault of their own be involved in criminal industries, seeing the traffickers as the criminals and them as the victim of the traffickers, rather than criminals themselves. And that's something I struggle with a lot with the work I do, because they're sought for other countries for crimes that they're said to have committed, but it's an uphill struggle. But to show that yes, they may have committed crimes, but they did so under the coercion of a trafficker, and it's really the trafficker that you should go after, and not the victim of trafficking. So that distinction as well.
That's critical. Yes, because apparently at some point you have this victim who then winds up being prosecuted as a criminal, and they were people might view not only the perpetrators of the crimes, but the victims as all sort of criminals, and that's not the case, right? So now the thinking is a more refined look at it, and give to, even give immunity to persons who've suffered the crime, right? And you're not prosecuting them. You're trying to.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. They've had enough.
Exactly right. And that's
right?
why
they've had enough.
They've had enough.
Yeah.
Exactly. So just because they're involved in some sort of criminal activity doesn't mean that that's something they've chosen to do, or that they're someone who should be, punished for that. So yeah, that's a really important distinction.
Yes. Okay. Well, this is a huge topic in a relatively short show. I want to go back to something about your practice that I found so interesting. I noticed that you were recently nominated in 2022 as the let me just get the title of this correct, because it's not an award we do here. Crime and Extradition Junior at the Legal 500 UK Bar Awards. Tell us a little bit about what that is and how you got nominated.
That's good. No, I didn't win, but I was obviously very honoured to be nominated. You must have something similar maybe in the US. You have legal directories, so one of them is called the Legal 500, and so I got that nomination, which is very nice. It's always nice to be nominated.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. I've absolutely loved talking to you. I'm glad we got the chance to do this and to raise some awareness. And I hope that everyone looks for the links that you're going to put up at the end of the podcast. And anyone can make a donation. Fantastic. But even on a small scale, as we talked about, just look at your supply chains, look at where you're buying your clothes, look at where you're buying your food, look at your neighbor, look in your community. It's everywhere. So thank you for raising awareness and for having me today.
Thank you. So grateful. And thank you all listeners for tuning in. We hope it's been worth your while. Thank you for tuning in to Vale la Pena. Please join us in making an impact together for people, animals, and the environment. Details in the show notes. You can find this show through my website at www.rebuslegal.com and on YouTube, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. I'm your host, Cynthia Rebus, and I welcome and thank you for your feedback, comments, questions, and sharing this show with others.